Why former Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad, veteran opposition leader Lim Kit Siang, and his son Lim Guan Eng, former finance minister, did not prioritize or enforce mandatory asset declarations during their tenures involves a mix of political, cultural, and systemic factors. Below is an analysis of the possible reasons. 1. Mahathir Mohamad's reluctance. Historical context: during Mahathir's first tenure as PM, 1981 to 2003, transparency reforms like asset declarations were not a global priority, even in democracies. His administration focused on rapid economic growth and political stability, often sidelining governance reforms seen as risky to his authority. Centralized power. Mahathir's leadership style was highly centralized, and he resisted checks on executive power. Mandatory asset declarations could have exposed his allies, or himself, to scrutiny, potentially destabilizing his coalition, Barisan Nasional. Political pragmatism. Pushing for asset declarations might have alienated key figures in UMNO and the civil service, whose support was critical to maintaining power. Corruption was often tolerated as a necessary evil to secure loyalty. Later stance. During his second term as PM, 2018 to 2020, with Pakatan Harapan, PH, Mahathir's government did introduce voluntary asset declarations for ministers, but these were not legally binding or fully transparent. Critics argue this was a half-hearted measure to appease reformers without systemic change. 2. Lim Kit Siang and Lim Guan Eng, DAP. Opposition legacy. As longtime opposition figures, Lim Kit Siang and the DAP historically advocated for accountability. However, when the DAP joined the PH coalition, 2018 to 2020, they faced constraints. Coalition politics. PH was a fragile alliance of ideologically diverse parties, e.g., Bersatu, PKR, DAP. Pushing for aggressive reforms like mandatory asset declarations risked fracturing the coalition, especially with Mahathir's Bersatu, which included UMNO defectors. Lim Guan Eng's legal issues. As finance minister, 2018 to 2020, Lim Guan Eng was embroiled in corruption charges, e.g., the Penang undersea tunnel case. Implementing strict asset declarations could have opened him, or allies, to further legal and political attacks. Prioritization. PH focused on bigger reforms, e.g., abolishing GST, institutional reforms, but hesitated on asset declarations due to fears of backlash from bureaucrats and coalition partners. 3. Systemic barriers in Malaysian politics. Lack of political will. Both Barisan Nasional and Pakatan Harapan governments have avoided stringent asset declaration laws because many politicians across parties have vested interests. Exposing wealth could reveal illicit gains or undermine patronage networks. Weak institutions. Even if laws were passed, enforcement bodies like the Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission, MACC, have historically been perceived as politicized. Without judicial independence, audits of politicians' assets could be suppressed. Cultural norms. Malaysian politics often operates on patronage and discretion. Publicly declaring assets clashes with a culture where elite wealth is seldom questioned openly. 4. Public and civil society pressure. Limited public demand. Until recently, there was insufficient grassroots pressure for asset declarations. Corruption was normalized, and voters often prioritized economic issues over governance reforms. Selective scrutiny. Media and civil society, e.g., Bersi, have focused on specific scandals, e.g., 1MDB, rather than systemic transparency measures. Politicians faced no electoral consequences for opposing asset declarations. 5. Contrast with Anwar Ibrahim's government. Anwar Ibrahim's administration, 2023-present, has pledged to enforce mandatory asset declarations for ministers, though critics question its enforcement and public accessibility. This shift reflects growing public demand for accountability post-1MDB, but historical reluctance by predecessors like Mahathir and PH highlights how deeply entrenched the resistance to transparency has been. Conclusion. Mahathir, Lim Kit Siang, and Lim Guan Eng operated in a political ecosystem where power consolidation, coalition fragility, and systemic corruption outweighed the incentives for transparency. While they positioned themselves as reformers, Their actions, or inaction, on asset declarations reveal the gap between rhetoric and political reality. Structural reforms require not just laws but a fundamental shift in Malaysia's political culture, a challenge no leader has fully embraced.